it can be one of the misconceptions of what we do within Digital Humanities here, that we're all about the stuff. We are about the data and the code and the thinking about that production, and we are about the more computational processes as well, but they're harder to show.
This is James Baker, head of the Digital Humanities Group at Southampton University in the south of the UK, and my guest for this episode. And as he just said, there's a lot more to Digital Humanities than meets the eye, as you will find out. I met James for the first time in 2021 when he just took the role of Director of Digital Humanities at Southampton University. James was building a digital humanities team from the ground up, a bit of a challenge given the time we were in late 2021, COVID and all. I wanted to catch up with James again for two reasons. First of all, of course, to see how he got on more than 3 years after we met, and also to get a better understanding of what digital humanities actually entails. My admittedly very naive assumption being that digital means software. And to be fair, there are a few use cases in humanities where software is being used and needed. For instance, a few years ago, I talked to a bunch of musicians who used generative AI in their work. Or at UCL, there was a project to build a database and catalogue for an archaeology department. But software is only part of what digital stands for in digital humanities. And that became quickly clear when I stepped into the building of Southampton University one very sunny and nice day in July this year, where James and his team sit. Before we started our chat, James actually showed me around, and there were a number of tools and facilities in what they call the Digital Hub, or DigiHub for short, all used to digest and produce digital content of all sorts, including their very own podcast studio. Which, of course, is exactly where James and I sat down next.
So I am James Baker. I'm Professor of Digital Humanities at the University of Southampton. I run the Digital Humanities team here at Southampton Digital Humanities, we call ourselves. We're based out of the DH Hub, which is on our Avenue campus at Southampton.
Which is where we are today.
In a slightly warm room because it's got a slanted roof and an old beautiful building, but yeah.
We're sitting in a very exciting place. We're sitting in where the podcasting happens. So I see 4 microphones and I see a nice audio panel, etc. So you're doing actually the What the Ref podcast. Are there any other podcasts that you do?
No, I just do the What the Ref one, which is relatively new as part of the Hidden Ref campaign around recognising all roles in research.
Maybe talk a little bit about the Hidden Ref a little bit later. But first, let's talk about the Digital Humanities at Southampton. And because we actually had a conversation before, and I had to look it up because it's quite some time ago. It was in 2022, I believe. And you were then just starting. And that's 3 years ago. Well, 3.5 years ago. A lot has happened. What has happened in the meantime?
A lot has happened. So when we spoke last, we were in the process of kind of building up Digital Humanities at Southampton. So I was very much hired as a director to make a plan and execute a plan. And that's kind of what we've been doing the last 4 years. That doesn't mean necessarily that everything we'd planned to do has been what we did, and some of the things we've done we didn't plan to do, if that makes sense. But the main thing we've been doing is building up a staff base. So a staff base of technicians, a staff base of academics who can run the group. Alongside that, we've been continuing to invest in our estate. So we started out with a lot of equipment purchased through a large grant, and we've since been adding on top of that based on staff demand, student demand, things people need, making better use of that equipment. And we've been sort of designing kind of ways of working and processes that means we can work across the humanities with all staff and students to help them, whatever kind of stage they're at, think about whether they want to do anything a bit digital, so using tech, or whether they want to do something a bit more computational, that is, working with data in some form, and fluidly between those things. That's kind of how we work. Alongside which, of course, you've had the spectre of AI coming along.
Yes.
Which is, changing how all of us work, but is not the thing that I try and fixate on too much, if I'm honest.
Okay, well, maybe we can touch on that a bit later. But how many staff do you currently have? How many staff are employed as part of the Digital Humanities?
I'll say from the 1st of August, because we've got a new colleague joining us, but we've got 6 colleagues who work on an academic contract of different forms, one of whom is more enterprise focused, so they're more commercialization focused, which I can also talk about later if you're interested. We have 3 wonderful technicians, and we have another colleague who works as a training officer. And then alongside that, we have colleagues who are kind of connected in and sort of give some of their time ultimately to what we do from across the school, including our wonderful folks in professional services who provide us with leadership and administrative support, and then colleagues across the school who have kind of aligned intellectual agendas, whether they're in music or film or English or history or whatever, and contribute to the development of digital humanities here. So there's a small core team of us that effectively work across a large school, and that's been really exciting to build that up because, as I often say to my colleagues, we didn't start out with a plan for I would like one person who does computational history, or I would like one person who does media theory and film, right? We just said, here are some jobs. They're for anyone in the humanities, whether they're computational or whether they are more media theoretical, and we just want the best people, and we'll build that up from there. And that's been really exciting. And alongside that, I should say, partly because I forgot, and that's not because I want to forget, is that alongside that we have wonderful PhD students who've joined us the last few years who we see as part of our community as well. So when we meet on Monday mornings every week for our team stand-up catch-up, there's me, there's my colleagues, there's technicians, there's PhD students, there's visiting people as well, and it's a really lovely, vibrant environment we've created.
Okay, that's about 20 people then standing in that stand-up.
No, not that many, because ultimately the wider sort of group are less part of those kind of weekly team meetings. But, we get up to sort of 12, 13 people sometimes, yeah.
Southampton Humanities, we're sitting in the Digital Hub with a podcast room.
Yep.
But there's also another building that deals with archaeology, and I think you mentioned music. Are these the 2 central areas of humanities in Southampton? Is there such a thing as a central humanities thing that Southampton focuses on, or is it just across the board?
So we're all based on Avenue Campus, well, apart from the music department. If I try to remember all my different subject areas in our humanities, we include archaeology, which is a specialist building within our campus just across the road. As some of your listeners will be aware, there's various forms of kind of labs that an archaeology group needs, so they have that. Music are over on our main Highfield campus, right near the centre of campus, right near the exhibition hall. And then the rest of our school includes history, English, philosophy, modern languages, and film, which do include some digital media components as well, and that encompasses in our school. So a great deal of the activity within humanities happens in this building, on this campus, and it means that there's a nice fluidity between the different parts of what we do. There's no sort of area that is just for the English people or another area that's just for the philosophy people. There's a lot of kind of crossover and interaction, and it also means that our students, from my experience, yes, they are here to study a particular subject area, but it means that they have a good sense of crossover with other students in the school, particularly when they come and take our modules, which are more interdisciplinary kind of digital humanities modules.
When we talk about digital humanities, my first thought was that this is software, okay, and you need software, let's say, for bringing up a website, and maybe we can talk about that, what kind of software needs exist, for instance, in music or in archaeology. But here in the Media Lab or in the Digi Hub, what we're seeing is actually lots of other digital artifacts being produced, like video, like sound. I think we talked about in this little tour just now about sonification. Yeah. So there is a lot more than just writing software, isn't there?
I guess the thing is that the equipment and the things you see around you are one manifestation of what we do. So some of what we do is that students and staff need access to equipment, and they need access to technicians who can support them in using that. So it might well be that, they want to make a podcast, or they might want to use a similar piece of equipment to record some audio for a voiceover on a film, or they might use a similar piece of equipment to practice out the way they speak in certain languages or certain accents as part of the work they're doing in, say, languages, linguistics in some form, right? There's multiple uses for different techs. And tech is something that I guess traditionally humanities groups haven't always had a huge amount of access to. And part of our job was to look after, promote, and provide access. Now, the more software, data, computational, ontology-based stuff you're also talking about, that's less visible. And we also don't need rows of computers to do that work. We need expertise that can support people. So if a third-year history student pops into my office and says, I heard you do some stuff around digital history, James. I say, yeah. And it's so I'm doing my dissertation. How do I turn a bunch of addresses into coordinates? Surely that's possible. And that becomes a set of conversations about how you might structure your data in such a way that means you can use some kind of computational piece of tech. Maybe it's something more code oriented. Maybe it's something a bit more simpler, like using Open Refine or something. But those things are kind of less visible. So it can be one of the misconceptions of what we do within Digital Humanities here, that we're all about the stuff. We are about the data and the code and the thinking about that production, and we are about the more computational processes as well, but they're harder to show. I mean, we do have a couple of machines that are often running stuff. This morning I was started running a web archiving job I needed to do. So one of our machines with the monitors just turned itself off. It's just running through this thing that's going to run all weekend, right?
Yeah.
And so we do support that kind of work as well. It's just somehow less visible. And I guess one of our jobs is to ensure those things have that visibility. The thing I would say, though, is that within our educational work, it's quite visible because we are quite computational. Within our workshops we run, it's quite visible because some of those are more about working with data and doing compute stuff. Within the PhD studentships we have, some of those students are doing quite computational work. And then again, in the research projects we work on. So depending on your visibility point, I guess you'd see us quite differently.
What interests me, because I've been working in another group at UCL in London, and they've been built around the concept of we've been written into a research grant, and then, which is, I think, a model that's being used in a number of different universities. You're being written in a research grant, you provide a software engineer, or if you like, a technician. So how does this work then with the digital hub? Because it feels a little bit more ad hoc, and there might not be such a thing as a research project for 6 months or 2 years. So how does it work with you then, if I may ask?
I guess there's two parts of it. So one part of it is that we are an independent group. That doesn't mean we're entirely independent of the university, but we're independent. We pursue our own research. We provide our own teaching opportunities that we think are important in consultation with our colleagues. So on one hand, we're not a kind of driven entirely by research income to underpin our kind of not research income, driven entirely by any form of income to underpin what we do in terms of, we have to go and get 100% cost recovery as a research software engineering group, for example. So we're not that kind of model in that sense. There are parts of what we do that are, though. We do get involved and collaborate with colleagues who are trying to drive forward research agendas where maybe they feel slightly less comfortable or confident in something that's a bit more data orientated. And one of us might get involved by being a co-I, for example, and co-investigator, which enables them to connect better with some of the kind of more computational expertise they're bringing in, whether that is research software engineering or whether that is an external consultancy of some kind or some kind of other partnership. So we do get involved there. We have some research facilities here. So actual track listed research facilities. That means that people can come to us and say, I want 3 days of your time. The model I always give, because I think it always works in people's heads, it's like a wind tunnel. So across campus, there's the lovely wind tunnel. If you want a wind tunnel for 2 days of time, there's a precise cost. And for that precise cost, you get access to the wind tunnel. You get access to, some technicians that can support you, and they get some wear and tear on the actual wind tunnel itself during its being used. And that's the same with us. So we have a research facility based around fabrication and 3D capture, another one based around 2D digitization, 3D digitization, another one based around using our Igloo facility, our 360 audiovisual environment, and then a fourth one around something I've entirely forgotten, but that doesn't matter. but the point is they come in the same way, which is like, they are, here's a bunch of stuff that you can use as part of a project. There's a set cost, you cost it in, you get some of our technicians. And that was really important to me to get that up and running because it means that particularly our technicians get properly recognized in research projects for the contributions they're making. And it's not that colleagues would, but it's not that people are putting in bids that say, oh, we'll just use the DH hub and they'll support us in this thing. And then someone rocks up to us after getting a grant and says, so can you help out with all this for free? And we're like, well, no. So it means that there's a proper mechanism for doing that. The third part, just cover that off, is that we also have within Digital Humanities, we have a group dedicated to digital preservation, which is relatively new. Digital Preservation Southampton, which launched earlier this year. And that is a fully kind of consultancy side part of what we do. So we do training, we do support, we do advice and that kind of stuff. We are involved working with organizations who have digital preservation needs, trying to help them get from where they are to where they want to get to. We don't build the software, but we do provide the architectures through which someone can actually look after digital things in the long term. So we aren't like an RSE group. And of course, we have a wonderful research software engineering group here at Southampton who we do work with as well, right? We're not like that kind of RSE group model, but we have a kind of a multi-part model, I guess is the point. And from this year, we're running a new master's program independently on our own. So this is a kind of like we have lots of different things that we're doing as part of our work here at Southampton. That's, as you say, going back to where we started, a lot has changed in the last 2.5 years.
So going back to a lot has changed. What actually hasn't quite worked out that in the 3 years? Can you think of anything that you thought, oh, this is what we're going to do, but it hasn't actually come to pass, or not in the way that you thought it would?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I'll start with the MSc, actually. We're starting a new master's program this September called, it's an MSc in Digital Humanities, Data Science in brackets. There's reasons why it's called that. It's mostly to do with kind of search engine optimization. It's a computational humanities master's, effectively. And it's really meant for, you're an undergrad, you're leaving your undergrad, you love film, history, music, whatever it might be. You want to kind of carry that on, but you also want to develop a bunch of skills that are a bit more computational. This is the degree we're offering to you to do that, where you get to carry on your interests, but do that alongside learning more kind of data science techniques for working with data that come out of film and music and history and English or whatever. Now, I bring that up as an example because that wasn't in the plan. In fact, when I started, very much, my default position was, no, we're not running a new master's in digital humanities. That sounds like a bad idea. There's loads of competition's not a word I like within higher education, but there's lots of other people doing similar things. They, in some cases, have geographical and reputational advantages. For example, that they are, in London or something, or some other reason for that. And we decided that might be not the best use of our time. And yet we kind of looked at things and went, well, actually, maybe it would be a good thing to do. Maybe there's a particular niche we can work in. And we kind of worked with this idea that something a bit more on the computational end rather than a kind of broader kind of digital humanities degree might be quite valuable, and landed on that and did it. Now, obviously, I'm really happy that's happening. I'm not like, oh my God, this is terrible negative. We're running a new program. But it's we are not formally a department. So we're having to kind of create from scratch all of the structures by which someone would run a degree program, which is a massive piece of work. And I have to hugely credit my colleague Lexi Webster in particular for their work bringing that together. But it was unexpected. The other end of the spectrum, I think, there's been some times we've bought pieces of equipment and really thought, you know what, people will love that. They'll want to use that.
And no one used that then.
Yeah, it's not quite no one, but it's like sort of the demand hasn't been there that we maybe thought there would be.
Like, for instance?
Well, the Igloo is a good example. I wasn't involved when the Igloo was purchased, this 6-meter wide audiovisual space. It takes up most of a room, right? Now, that has not been as much of a draw as I probably thought it might be when I first arrived and it'd been purchased as part of a large grant. I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Now, it's had some amazing, really interesting uses. A wonderful project a colleague had involving people in different civic organizations doing more creative practice work, which they wouldn't usually do as part of their roles, and creating media that would go in spaces like that to kind of communicate part of what they do and like the work in the community with disadvantaged people, whatever it might be, right? So there's been some really, really nice uses, but it's underused. And then recently, one of our new technicians came in and said, well, okay, it's being a bit underused. I can kind of see why. It's not the easiest to make media for. Why don't we just run it as an exhibition space? Why don't you just leave the door open during term time? Why don't we put a little sign outside? Why don't we just turn stuff on in the morning and leave it on and just see what happens? See if people walk in. If they walk in and see something and then knock on our door and say, how do I do that? Then we got it going. And that was a really simple solution. And I guess in a way, it shows the value of having, as a growing team, the variety of ideas that people have from their different perspectives they might bring to something and say, this thing that's not working, why don't we try this? Last summer, we had a sort of big drive towards trying to root out the things that we did just because I set them up at the beginning when it was just me. Because I wanted to make sure we weren't doing things because that's just how James set them up. But actually, we looked at things and said, are we doing this still for the right reasons, or do we need to change how we do it? And so there's been examples there around things like equipment where different voices, different perspectives are actually given us different viewpoints on how we can make usage happen for equipment that otherwise maybe is being underused. But otherwise, the room we're in right now with the podcast suite is used all the time.
Is it? Well, we can talk about this maybe a little bit later because that interests me. What I found also interesting is the fact, as you said, it's not like another RSE groups. You have different roles. You have technicians as well. We have a big discussion about recognition of different roles in science. And, we have obviously a big lobby group in terms of research software engineers, but roles like technicians or in other roles, librarians, for instance, get forgotten. But here in Southampton, it seems to kind of merge together in this group. Is that a right impression?
Certainly in our group. We do have, in the school, we do have technicians who work in other departments. There's a dedicated media technician who works in film, who's actually also one of our PhD students. And there's dedicated technical support in archaeology, as historically one of those professions that does have a lot of technical expertise embedded. And there also is in music as well, unsurprisingly. I think what's interesting about our group is that as a percentage of all the people that we have, like the technicians historically have been a large part of it. The first person we hired was a technician. That was my first ask. There was a bunch of boxes and equipment that had been purchased. I said, well, I need a technician. And so for a long time it was, me, one of our colleagues from professional services, and a technician. And that's how we built up DH here from the beginning. The ambition that we have is to ensure that we continue to invest in those things, because I think it's very important, and the viewpoints of those individuals are just as valued as everybody else's. We also have ambitions to find a way of integrating research software engineering into what we do as well, because I think that would be incredibly valuable. There's really wonderful models out there, other institutions of more humanities orientated RSEs being embedded either in RSE groups or embedded more locally in a department or a school of some kind with a kind of dedicated purpose. Cambridge Digital Humanities, a real shout out here, for example, having a dedicated research software engineer embedded in their Digital Humanities program at master's level, which I think has been a real game changer for them in terms of making sure their students can really be confident to do computational work as part of a master's degree. And we have ambitions in that area, and we'll, of course, work with our research software engineering colleagues here at Southampton to try and realise that. But yeah, for me, it's the advantage, I guess. There's a number of times people say to me, it's really good how you work. That way of working seems really great. That seems really interesting. We should learn from that. I said, yeah, but you have to remember, we built this from the ground up. It wasn't that I walked into a situation where there was a whole department I was brought in to manage or lead in some form and then just transformed it overnight. It was like, okay, let's start from first principles. What do we think will work? And as we get bigger, there's obviously a risk that some of that culture and the things we've created will change. And that's something we're really attentive to. We had an away day recently. I asked all my colleagues to write down one thing they're excited about next year. And one of the things that people need to look out for is we're getting bigger. We're going to have our own students for the first time. It's really going to change that kind of dynamic in terms of our size. But starting from the ground up gives you those advantages to go, you know what? We should keep technicians within the center of the group rather than somehow feeling as though they're on the outside.
So you moved basically from being a startup into a more settled organization now. But one aspect that you mentioned earlier, and that was the commercialization aspect, which we haven't talked about. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I know this from other universities as well, where sometimes research software, there might be a way of turning this into a product that actually can be sold for profit. So it can be commercialized, in other words. Is that something that you're pursuing as well? And how do you help with that?
So the commercialization thing is very specific. I'll very briefly, if you'll forgive me, talk about university strategy. Our university strategy has this thing called the triple helix, which has people at the center of it, as in like the triple helix, you would imagine, visualizing it. And then around that go research, education, and knowledge exchange and enterprise. That third one, KEE as we call it, knowledge exchange and enterprise, being that kind of three components what we do. What that has enabled effectively is for a greater recognition of roles that are focused on knowledge exchange and enterprise. And a desire to do more in some parts of university around either knowledge exchange, so working with communities, or around enterprise, which might be more commercial. Historically, arts and humanities, brilliant at knowledge exchange. That's what we do. We are wonderful researchers, but particularly at Southampton, we know knowledge exchange is a big part of what we do. We have our Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities, which do great work in that area. Enterprise, less so. Research commercialization is not as much of a thing in the arts and humanities. Actually, in the arts it is. But in the humanities, historically, it's not the sort of thing we do. So where our commercialization group around digital preservation came around was because there was a question in the school about, what can we do? What sort of activities could we get involved in where there's a potential for income generation from external partners, which is not to do with grants, but to do with consultancy or direct working with third parties in some way, but also meet some of our social values commitments at the same time. So it's not just rampant commercialization working with bad actors, but is, commercialization that cross-funds in a way activities with the kind of people we'd like to work with and support. There were a number of different options. I floated the idea of something around digital preservation. I've been working in that field on and off for over a decade, observed effectively that we know how to look after digital things from a kind of technical level in the long term, but actually it's really hard socially. And actually there's many organizational blockers as to why it doesn't happen, including the most simplest, people valuing physical stuff more than things that are data only, bought digital materials. And just observing over the years that, I could see professionals really struggling in that area. So I'd pitched the idea that, we could create something here that could be income generating from organizations that can afford it, around providing that advice and support and strategizing around digital preservation, and some particular activities like data recovery and things like that, which we can do in-house. But alongside that also could provide to those smaller organizations, civic organizations in ODA recipient countries, for example, we could do some good there as well and really do good work in sectors we care about. Because ultimately, with my historian hat on, because that's where I come from, I care about stuff that's made that might be used by people in the future to try and understand a period and understand a culture, understand a society. And I'm not one of those people who's worried about there being a digital dark age, but I am concerned that organizations that, say, have a particular remit in a certain area are struggling to be able to collect materials that are, people don't give you boxes of letters anymore, right? They give you computers, and struggling to actually collect and look after that material and don't always know what to do with it. And I felt if we could create a commercialization unit that on one hand could make income from those who can afford it and then cross-fund those who couldn't, who could less so, we could do some real good. And that's what we started. And we're really at the start of our journey of that. But the main thing I'm proud about is that we've been able to do something that creates more capacity in that sector, which is particularly the cultural heritage sector, really struggling at the moment. So, but that's our thing we're going to try and do. And, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. I'm not the kind of person who's into sunk cost fallacies. We will look at this in a hard-headed way. And if it's not working, that staffing will get resourced onto something else. That's the kind of thing that we've been working on since, we launched in January. So launched in January and already starting to work with partners, which has been great.
So preservation, we're talking about, I would like to look at a file that was created in the early 80s, but in a format that I can no longer read. Is that what it is?
Yeah, or I am an archive that is trying to accession a collection from someone who's a living individual who wants to give me some stuff they made 5 years ago, and I want to make sure in 20 years' time it can still be viewed. That kind of stuff. So it's both. It's both the bin diving of historic stuff and trying to recover it, and it's the how do we look after the present. And there's some wonderful work going on in that sector. The Digital Preservation Coalition do amazing work in that area. Right. Organisations like the Internet Archive do amazing work with things like the Wayback Machine, of course. And there's other organisations that do great work, but we felt there's more that can be done in that space. There's actually loads and loads of free guidance online of how to do this well. And the thing we identified and articulated was that despite that, organizations don't always know where to start, and they don't always know how to use that information and that guidance to the best of their abilities. And I think sometimes they just need someone else to come in and just help them.
So that's what you're offering the service is to actually help them find how to do it rather than you do it for them.
Yeah, and offer training and offer guidance and create roadmaps for how they might develop the work. For example, if they know they're going to have some money to go out to tender to try and support them in designing what that tender might look like. Or we do have some data recovery services, so we can do that as well. But a range of things in that area. And we're really learning from the initial partners we're working with what need looks like as well, because you can ask people and you can do surveys and you can think what the need is out there, and then you actually encounter people in real life situations and then they articulate very different needs. But as I said, early on doing this, but it's really exciting and we enjoy it.
One of the things that has come to the forefront of lots of people's mind is, of course, artificial intelligence. Not that artificial intelligence as such is new, but generative AI. Have you actually seen a change since you started and now, where there's more adoption, there's more need, there's more requirement?
Yeah, I mean, before I started at Southampton, I was finishing up a research project where one of the fun things I did during COVID, which is you had to keep yourself amused somehow, right?
Yes.
Was to use GPT-2, if you remember that, before GPT-3.
That was the stone age of GPT, was it?
Before ChatGPT appeared. Use GPT-2 and take some historical text that I knew about and kind of, as I like to call it, inflect the model in some way, and then try to recreate text that looked like, felt like, sounded like those things that I gave it. And that worked to a point, right? And actually provided some, I won't go into the details, but actually did provide some useful ways of thinking about the source materials I was looking at. And then when I started here, I actually rerun a workshop series, about 8 to 10 workshops a term, just on everything from how to make a podcast to large-scale analysis of text, whatever it might be. And when I first started, one of my first workshops was how to make a machine that can write, which was based on that. And another one was around text-to-image stuff, which, if you remember, was in its really early days at that time. And obviously, all that stuff has changed rapidly. I guess if I reflect on the last few years and what's changed in terms of our work, I think one thing is that I've probably spent a lot of my time telling people, don't fixate on the now, it's going to keep changing. I've observed some really wonderful, sensible, clear-headed views from colleagues around the things that they can understand about behaviours of, say, students in relation to using generative technologies. I'm not going to use the word cheat because I don't think that's appropriate. But, I don't know, a colleague saying to me that if you give whatever model they were using at a given moment a certain essay question, it is likely to parrot a narrative that I think is not the narrative that I had in my seminar room, if that makes sense. A different set of politics, which was interesting in and of itself. We've obviously seen a huge amount of discussion internally within humanities about what we do in response to this. We are principally, historically at least, a set of subject areas where people write a lot of essays. And we're having to think about what that means.
In terms of people using that AI for generating their own essays.
And, again, not using the word cheap, but thinking like, well, what is it that people are actually going to do in the world after they leave here? And what likelihood is there that their employers will require them to have an understanding of these technologies in some form? We run a module called Data, Culture and Justice that's about that relationship between data and social inequality. And part of that is around like trying to understand the political motivations that underpin the development of advanced technologies like so-called AI, to try and understand, well, why is it that AI works in such a way? Now, over the last few months, of course, we've found out that it's so explicit because one particular individual has decided to make his certain version of AI speak in a way that is so obviously skewed in certain ways. But it was much more subtle maybe 2-3 years ago when we started doing that work. And then on the research side, I guess that's where the really interesting stuff is. In some senses, it's colleagues thinking of applying technologies in some way. Been a huge issue in lots of humanities subjects for years about which kinds of text we can actually use as data. It tended to be also always the typewritten stuff, not the handwritten stuff, not those archives. Handwritten text recognition technology has advanced a lot through machine learning and AI, which means that stuff is more easily deployable. We have a Quen model on one of our deployed locally on one of our gaming PCs here in the hub, which can do handwriting to text. Now, it's not great, but the very fact we can deploy a handwriting model on a local machine compared to 4 or 5 years ago is totally extraordinary as a kind of computer vision model, right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. There's colleagues starting to approach not just me, but me and my colleagues asking questions about, could we embed this in our work? You do hear people say AI, and then you say, do you mean this by AI? And they go, oh yeah, I mean that by AI. And then they actually starting to be more precise in articulating what they mean by it. And it's really influencing how we're planning for something like our new masters. I will not claim to be someone who's wonderful at writing code. I always say I will try something till I run out of talent, and then I'll collaborate, right? That's how I tend to work. And I still will collaborate and do collaborate with things like RSEs, but I also now pair program with large language models because that's just sensible. I don't write my Python and R as often enough. That means I remember all the things I need to do. When I forget the things I kind of know how to do, I'm asking my friendly Gemini embedded in Google Colab, like, how do I do that thing I've forgotten? And it'll remind me of how to do the thing I've forgotten. And then it will tell me something else that, I actually really needed to know that I never thought about needing to know, right? Because I ask different questions. And we're thinking about how we embed that in our new masters because, we want students to leave our new master's degree with computational skills they can apply in the world. Well, there's no point.
And this is now part of it.
Yeah, there's no point teaching them. Well, we do need to teach them to some extent, like shell from the ground up. They need to know the basics, right? But they also don't need to know it without entirely that pair programming thing because that would be naive to kind of shield it from them. So we're going to have to find ways of embedding that within our education, embedding that within our assessment. But again, that's really exciting. And, the challenge is going to be that these things, as they have been for the last few years, are evolving a lot and trying to make sure year on year we need to keep up with. It's a big part of what we do. I was at a conference maybe a month ago, UK Ireland Digital Humanities Association conference, and a lot of the papers were about AI, a lot of the questions were. And depending on my mood, I'm more or less happy with that happening. I think we can talk about it a little bit too much. And as you said at the beginning, when you asked the question, sometimes is it really AI? Every time someone says, "But is AI?" I'm like, is it really? I mean, I'm sure we were doing that way before we started talking about AI all the time. But, there are advanced computational technologies that can be usefully used and increasing number of people in the humanities who are using them sensibly. Some people who remain a bit scared and want to just shut everything off. But I guess as a final reflection, a senior colleague emailed me from humanities a couple of weeks ago, effectively saying like, I just had one of those moments where I realized this is going to be important, right? and not that he was like shutting it off before, but he was just in the background and he's saying like, I've just kind of realized that the people who are super pro this are kind of wrong. And the people who are super against this are kind of wrong. And there is just something.
The truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and yes, quite rightly, we can be grumpy about the feeling sometimes that we have to adapt to these large technologies that have appeared primarily through like gross copyright theft. We can be grumpy about that because at the same time, it's like there are clearly some really interesting opportunities here. And I just want to know more and I just want to run some stuff by you. And can we have a bit of an email exchange? And that's cool. And that's actually quite nice that that's coming out of people who, not individuals I thought would be like, diehard holdouts, but like just coming out of people just like thinking, okay, this is important. I need to think about it. And then them starting to really reflect on, their education, their research and how those things are likely to change, but how they can accommodate those changes in ways that make them feel positive, not just sort of the sheer visceral anti-reaction kind of thing.
And that's basically where you are. I mean, you're including this obviously in the master program now to some extent, and you're using that in the field, but you're also keeping an eye on it. How useful is it really?
Yeah, and so one of the modules I teach is called Data Environmentalism. It's about the relationship between tech and climate change. And the reason I picked that as a topic was not because AI is the most energy-hungry thing on the planet. It is not. It is growing and it is important, but if we assume that information technologies in total are something between 2 to 5, 6% of global carbon emissions,
that leaves us with 94% of the rest.
Yeah, and it's important and significant. But the reason I teach that module is not because of that, and I'm very keen to show my students the ways in which there are other industries we need to put scrutiny on as well. Fashion industry, travel, etc., etc. The reason we focus there is because it's something that's hidden from us. All that compute is something we don't see. And it's one of those areas where it helps students understand infrastructure and be able to kind of open the lid a bit in infrastructure. We visit, as part of this module, our university's data center, which is like the loudest, hottest, gnarliest place you can imagine.
I know, I've been in one of them.
They're amazing. And the guy who runs it, he opened the back of one of the server units going into our new supercomputer. So you put your hand there, you can feel the cold air streaming out as it's passed through. He said, I'm now going to open the back and just feel the change. And it was just being in front of an inferno. It was just extraordinary. Yeah. And I hadn't taken a student on that module the first year we'd ran it, and then had the idea from a colleague at another university. And just the way in which that connected so much together with the students was amazing. So ever since then, I've been saying to everybody, I also run something called the Digital Humanities Climate Coalition, which is works in this area as well. And there, or in any other context, I tell people, if you're interested in this stuff, go to your institutional data center. It is so much fun. I guarantee your institutional data center manager will love people coming to visit you, because not many people do, and their work is amazing. And they're also sometimes thinking, we're really critical infrastructure and nobody knows about us, because they are. The extent to which I didn't realize till we visited that I was trying to find where it was. There's a reason why you can't find a university data center on a map, because it's considered critical infrastructure. So it's not on Google Maps. It's not listed on university directories.
And it may not be even on the campus.
It has it's definitely not on the campus. It doesn't have a sign outside that says University of Southampton. It doesn't have the building number until you get in. You wouldn't even know. It's just a bland industrial unit. You wouldn't even know it was the university's data center until you get inside. And then apparently there's ones for other major businesses in the same business park, because lots of those business parks, which used to have the painter and decorators kind of supply stores and stuff, right? They still have some of that, but they also have loads of data centers now, it seems. Yeah. So it's really interesting how those infrastructures of our lives are being hidden from us, and then the tech industry is very good at being all shiny and progressive and we are the good guys kind of thing. And going to those spaces just reminds you of just how industrial this stuff is. So that's why we do it. And I think that's going back to where your question started. Yes, using various complex, advanced computational technologies, definitely the thing we want to do some of, but do it in a context of thinking about some of the other intersections with that. So some of those are environmental, some of those are to do with inequalities, some of that's to do with the way in which certain power structures are dominant around these technologies. And that's the way in which we as a group frame our usage, which is through those lenses.
Finally, because I think we're coming to the end now, James, and you have other things to do, we're sitting in this podcast room, and I know that you're doing What the Ref. I guess you're doing that in here.
I don't actually know, but I'll come back to that. No, I do that at my desk.
Oh, well, okay. But somebody is doing that in here. So how many podcasts are being produced here? Is it for teaching people to do podcasts, or is it for people actually running podcasts, or is it a mix of both?
This space basically exists because when the Digital Humanities Hub was being built and was designed, slightly before my time, there was a recognition that we needed on this campus some spaces for audio recording for different purposes that was different from, say, what music needs for like music studios and stuff. So this room has a little bit of sound dampening, for example, when you come in, which is nice. We had initial investments in podcast facilities, and then we then quite quickly realized we needed more. We needed more audio recorders, needed stuff people could take off site. We needed boom like audios to go with like recording with cameras. We needed that funny thing over there I'm pointing towards, which doesn't work on podcasts, which is a little kind of box you can pop your head into to speak into a microphone to do stuff for voiceovers.
Oh, that's what it's for.
Yeah, that's what it's for.
Well, people can't see that, obviously, but it looks like in these old hairdresser studios. It's like one of those hubs that you put over the head.
You put over your head
to do the
do your perm. Yeah. It does look quite similar. But what became clear quite early on was that there was a lot of demand for audio recording. Yeah. It comes from a couple of different places. Some of it is to do with people who are academics or PGRs wanting to do some kind of podcast series that is knowledge exchange, communicating their work. So this morning, actually, there was a colleague from psychology who was in here. So a colleague from psychology working with one of their undergrads who does a podcast series. This year, there's also 2 other podcast series came out this space. Another from a colleague who's in archaeology around early human societies, and another that's been published is coming out this year based on working here on a colleague who works on visual cultures of war. So war photography, things like that. So there's some really concrete outputs that come from using this space. During term time, it's particularly towards the end of term time, it gets used a lot by our students. So there's a number of assessments across the School of Humanities, either ones that we run in Digital Humanities or in other parts, where students can choose to make things that are kind of more public facing, so not writing an essay. So they might make a school pack, or they might make a campaign of some kind, or they might make a podcast. And so these studios get used for that work. So what tends to happen is students can book the space, one of our technicians help them get set up, but the technician doesn't stay. They get them set up, they go away, they do the work themselves, and then if they have a problem, they come back. And so this is not like a super facilitated space. It's more of a space in which we want people to learn how to do something like create a podcast and then, do it for themselves. And during the end of term, around assessment time, there's just loads going on in here. It's booked out, I don't know, over 10 slots a week, because we do it morning, afternoon. So it's probably booked out about 5 or 6 a week, which is really interesting. Some of it is voiceover work for videos as well. We also have 1 or 2, as you will know, a lot of podcasts now are on YouTube, which I still think is a strange concept. But we've also set it up in here so you can do it as a visually recorded podcast as well. One group of students, I can't not bring this up, were doing a creative piece of work where they did a sock puppet based podcast.
What is that?
Well, you've got a little socks on your hands, and you're doing your hands up and down to pretend to be a mouth.
Visually, how does it work audio?
Well, they recorded it with visuals, right? So it's on YouTube. But they did it so they recorded the audio, and then they recorded their hands in front of the podcast microphones going up and down as the sock puppets whilst the audio is playing.
Talk about sonification.
Exactly. So there's been loads of really interesting creative uses. And the final one is that some of the student societies also will use this space. So we don't say like you can only use it if you're doing it for a legitimate purpose. We kind of say to students, if you're a humanities student, you can use this for anything you want to, frankly. So it's kind of nice. It's an interesting introduction to me for using more complex forms of technology as part of a degree. It's not super complex, but complex enough. There's a little bit of it that we try to kind of embed a little bit thinking about data management. So like when you go away and take your data with you, don't just put it in one place. Like make a couple of copies, make sure one's backed up on something like Google Drive, Dropbox or whatever. Give it a sensible name so you don't forget afterwards what that kind of random .mp3 actually is. Like give it a name so you remember later you are the person who most need to know later down the line what the information is about something you recorded 5 years ago, and you're the person most likely to forget that stuff, right? So like just we kind of seed in little bits of thinking about good use of data in there as well. But yeah, it's not the only highly used space that we have, but it's definitely one of them that is the most. And our students are not just our students, but actually, visitors on things like open days are always like, that's really interesting that you have a semi-dedicated space for it. But if our listeners could see where we are right now, this is not like a fixed table on the ground. And one of the things that's really central to what we do is that as much as possible, things can be moved. So we've always created these spaces as being super flexible. We can move stuff around. So if someone wants to take this and move it somewhere else, they can. If they need to just move it into a corner to have something a bit more intimate, they can. If you'd come in here 6 months ago, there was a round table here, not 2 square tables or 2 rectangular tables. So we're always kind of moving things around based on what our kind of student staff are telling us what they need effectively. If things keep getting hotter in the summer, we'll have to move out this room entirely. But it's
not just now.
No, but it's nice and warm in the winter, so that's good.
Okay, thanks very much for your time, James.
That's right, Peter.
In the show notes attached, as usual, you'll find a few links to the Digital Humanities Hub at Southampton Uni, which includes a link to the GitHub repo. I hope this little whirlwind tour of what James and his team have been up to gives you an impression of all the things that Digital Humanities can do and deliver. Southampton is, of course, not the only university with a group working in Digital Humanities. Group like this can be found across the UK and many other countries. And there are associations and conferences and around Digital Humanities. So if you are working at a university, chances are that they might have a digital humanities group which might be able to help you with data preservation, creating digital content, helping you with design and user experiences, and all the other good stuff James and I have been talking about just now. Well, we're approaching the end of 2025 pretty fast now, and with it the end of this season of Code for Thought. Next week, indeed, will be the last English episode this side of New Year's Eve, and for that we're going to return to the fellowship of the Software Sustainability Institute, and where I will introduce you to another 3 fellows who got started early this year. I hope you tune in then. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya!